Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. Today is a LOdown with Lo, a solo episode. And this has been a highly requested episode. So I am excited for you guys to really be able to dive into the subject more because we actually haven't done a podcast episode on this very subject, kind of talk about it time from time on social media. But today will really function as a all-in-one resource for how to fuel around your workouts. We're going to be talking about pre-workout, post-workout, what the research says, what I've seen to really work with women that have hormone conditions, and how to maximize your hormones around these time frames, and all the specifics of what to know about fueling around your workouts. So let's start off by talking about pre-workout, and then we will wrap up going into post-workout. So there's a few things to think about as it relates to what you eat before a workout. First and foremost, it is essential that you do eat before workouts. A lot of people will fight me on that they feel better if they don't eat, that they just feel so bloated, their stomach can't tolerate it. But your digestive system is trainable. And so if you start very small with something that is a liquid-based source or something that is, very light, you can gradually over time increase that to something that is more substantial that does provide you with the best fuel source. So I want to leave you with that it is possible for things to change with time. If you also are just waking up not feeling hungry, I would look at two things: is, are you eating too much and too close to bedtime? That is possible. Ideally, we're eating about 2 hours before we go to bed, making sure that it's within your relative portion needs, that dinner isn't a extremely large meal. Dinner should really be the same size as all your other meals, if not even maybe a little bit lighter than your other meals for the day. And then also, are you waking up in a very stressed state? Because if cortisol is elevated, it's going to blunt those hunger hormones. And so if you're waking up in the middle of the night, especially around like 2 to 4 a.m., or you're waking up, you're feeling a lot of anticipatory stress for the day, this could be why it's blunting that hunger response, especially if you're also adding things like caffeine or rushing into the mix. So we want to assess what that environment looks like and start there, because waking up hungry in the morning is a good sign that your metabolism is functioning optimally and that your body's not constantly in fight or flight mode. So I say that to say that if you do work out in the morning time, try to have something small. We're going to talk about what that could look like, and know that it's possible for things to change with time. Also, depending on when you work out is really going to dictate what you eat and how soon you eat. So really, and this I feel like is very intuitive, the longer you are away from your workout, the more substantial of a meal you can have. The closer you get to the workout, the lighter it should be. So if you are 3 hours away from a workout, you could do a totally balanced meal that has vegetables, that has fat, that has starches, that has protein, and it should be fully digested by that workout. Maybe if you are someone that does feel like they digest slower, then I would probably do closer to like 3.5 hours, but somewhere in that 2 to 3.5 hour range, you can have a fully, normal sized meal. Now, once you get closer, so say that you're about an hour and a half away, that meal should start to look a little bit lighter. And we really want to be prioritizing here mainly easy digesting carbs and protein sources if you are in a carb burning state. If you are on a ketogenic diet, then disregard this information because your recommendations are going to look different. But for the majority of people who are carb fueled, then this is what the recommendations would be for your situation. So we want to look at is not having an incredible amount of fiber or fat at this meal. So if you normally would do a salad or do a bunch of nuts or seeds, those would be things that we would want to omit. We really want this meal to be carbohydrates and protein. The protein should be a lean protein source. So proteins that don't have a lot of oils and fat content with them. And then the carb source could be something like fruit or some type of starch that, again, doesn't have a ton of fiber. Probably wouldn't do like beans there, since those are very high fiber starch option. But really any of your other starch sources would be fine. Even like a whole grain or something, you should be able to digest in time. Now we want to make sure that we're definitely hydrating during this time period. We don't want to have a very large sum of sodium. Sodium brings water into the GI tract, and sodium is important around exercise, but a very large dose of it is not ideal. So we want to prevent doing things like LMNT packets or even like Redmond's, because not Redmond salt, but Redmond's, they have like a electrolyte mix. Prevent doing those because they are about 800 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium, which is way too much. We're looking at somewhere around 250 to 300 milligrams of sodium in this time period. There are a lot of other electrolyte options out there that fit the bill for that. Things like Cure, Drip Drop, those are all good options, but just be mindful of how much electrolytes you are consuming then. So easy digesting carbs and protein, and then a little bit of some sodium and some water, of course, somewhere around the amount of about 14 ounces of water. Really, that's about the maximum that you should be ingesting in 1 hour of during and around exercise. So we don't want to be like having a full Stanley cup of water right before we start a workout. It's going to feel very sludgy. You're going to feel like things are just moving in your stomach whenever you're starting exercise. Remember that the goal of exercise is to have fuel prior to be able to provide the substrates or the fuel source that our body utilizes during exercise, but it's not to take blood away from our working muscles. So if we have too much in the stomach or we have the wrong things in the stomach, then blood's going towards the gut to be able to help digest, and you don't have as much blood going towards the muscles to be able to help with muscle contraction, blood flow, all of those things that we want to maximize during exercise. So as you get closer and closer to exercise, that should become even lighter. So maybe an hour away from exercise, it could be something like a full bowl of oatmeal that has protein powder and fruit in it. But then maybe as you get closer to 30 minutes before exercise, it's something like just a piece of fruit with a couple of turkey slices. So you see it just decreases in quantity, but really the base of what that meal or snack looks like looks very similar. I really wouldn't eat any closer than 20 or 30 minutes before you start a workout, unless you are just like having a like a Noka or Fuel for Fire, something that's like very liquidy. But ideally, I would give yourself at least 20 or 30 minutes. And if you are going to have to eat that close to a workout, make sure that it's something that's very easily digestible. Now, during the workout, unless you are doing exercise that is continuous for more than 90 minutes, you do not need to be drinking electrolytes or eating anything during that workout. If it is very hot and humid out, depending on the climate you live in, then it may be helpful to have a little bit of some salt in your water or doing one of those like lower electrolyte type options. But I really would focus on that mainly before the workout and after the workout. If it's under 90 minutes and it's not continuous, so say you are doing something like one of our strength and hormones workouts, one of our strength training days where you're lifting, you're resting, you're lifting, you're resting, that would be considered a non-continuous workout. Even if it takes you 90 minutes, which hopefully they never do, they should never take you 90 minutes, it would not fall into the continuous workout category. However, if you were like marathon running and you were going on a run for distance, then you probably are going to be running for more than 90 minutes, especially as you start to get into some of your longer mileage training. As you get above 90 minutes, that is when you want to start replenishing electrolytes and carbohydrates with a little bit of protein and fat during your workouts. And really that should start to happen at about the 60-minute mark. So if you're running for more than 90 minutes, at about the 60-minute mark, we're looking for about that 250 milligrams of sodium with some of that potassium there. Generally, you want the potassium to always be about 30% of whatever the sodium ratio is. That's just kind of like a rule of thumb, but it doesn't have to be perfect there. And really, the best way to know exactly how much electrolytes you should be consuming is to do a sweat rate test, which is something that I do with our clients if we are working with someone that is an endurance athlete. But otherwise, then somewhere around that 250 to 300 milligram of sodium mark is a good reference. And then you're looking for about 150 calories per hour of exercise. And those calories should be mainly coming from carbohydrate. I would say about 80% of them, with the remainder coming from a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat. We want to make sure, again, that there's not a substantial amount of fat there. However, as women, we do burn not just carbs. Men burn more carbohydrate solely during exercise. We do burn a little bit more fat. And we are more prone, especially in the second half of your cycle when progesterone is elevated. Or if you are pregnant, then you obviously also have higher progesterone levels. And so when that progesterone is high, you are more prone to muscle protein breakdown, which means that your body's burning more amino acids during exercise, which is why we want a little bit of protein with whatever that intra workout is. So instead of doing things like honey stingers and goos and a lot of those things that are marketed towards athletes, instead really looking for more of a real food type option. I really do believe that those were made for male athletes. They were not made for women athletes or female athletes that have progesterone on board. And so it can look like something like a protein ball, or there's like pre-made options that are out there too, depending on like what your individual tolerance and needs are, that can work. And again, your digestive system is trainable. So 150 calories per hour is always a really good starting point, but that is something that we can also decrease, increase based off of your own individual needs. And some of like the most elite athletes in the world, they're able to consume 300 calories per hour because they've trained their gut to be able to tolerate that. And obviously, the more you consume during exercise, the lower likelihood you get into a energy deficit where you are glycogen depleted. You've probably, anyone that's listening to this that exercises, especially if you've ever done any type of competitive activity, you've probably felt the feeling of glycogen depletion before. It basically feels like you've balked, you're at a wall, you cannot push anymore. You're just like so depleted. That is glycogen depletion. It usually doesn't happen until you're at that 90 minutes of exercise mark. And that's why I say that unless you're exercising for more than 90 minutes, you don't really need to be replenishing with this food sources. But if you are exercising more than 90 minutes, start doing it at the 60-minute mark so that you can get ahead of that glycogen depletion. And then we're looking at doing that again every hour thereafter that you are continuing to exercise. So if you're going on a 3-hour run, then you would be doing that 3 times throughout the course of the run. So these are some things to think about. As I mentioned as well, amino acid oxidation or burning, it's just a fancy word for burning, is higher, especially as you get into more of the long distance training. So if you are running a half marathon, you're probably not burning very many amino acids. If you're running a marathon, there's definitely more amino acids that are being burned. And so something that I used to like to do when I used to run is I would actually add in a little bit of amino acids into my water, and I would hold my water when I ran. So that is an option that can be explored as well. But again, it really just depends on your training and what your setup looks like. After the workout. So after the workout, people always ask, what should I eat and how quickly should I eat? What we know from the newer research is that it's not so much about how quickly you eat after the workout as it is what is the interval between when you last ate and when you're finishing the workout. So say, for example, you were doing the situation of eating 2 hours before you started the workout. Well, by the time that you got done with the workout, it's probably been at least 3 hours since you've last eaten. And so we want to make sure that you are now eating within about an hour of finishing that workout, because we know that muscle protein breakdown, which is essentially our needs for leucine, which is an amino acid that's really important for muscle building, are increased, are needed every 3 to 5 hours. So I like to really target somewhere around that 4-hour time frame to really be able to maximize that muscle protein synthesis time. So you would be looking at trying to eat within an hour after the workout. If you've only had a little snack before the workout and it had like 10 grams of protein in it, something not very substantial, I would still follow that rule of thumb of eating within an hour, because you didn't really eat a full meal, right? You didn't hit the leucine threshold. In order for us to hit that leucine threshold to be able to maximize muscle protein synthesis, you do need about 30 grams of protein. So if you ate really quickly before the workout, you did not eat 30 grams of protein, then you're going to need to eat soon after finishing the workout. So keep that in mind. It really goes based off of what happened prior to the workout, not necessarily the time frame after the workout. Now, after the workout, the recommendations look pretty similar. However, we can definitely incorporate some fibers and some fats into that meal as well. We still want the carbohydrates to be the priority macronutrient here. And the reason for that is because you have the greatest insulin sensitivity after exercise, especially after you've done strength training. Your muscles are like a sponge to that carbohydrate. They, instead of that carbohydrate hanging out in your bloodstream, insulin having to come in to be able to help shuttle that carbohydrate into cells, Instead, your muscles, their glycogen is depleted. And so they're like, please refuel me. I'm so hungry. And so insulin doesn't have to work as hard. And that carbohydrate goes straight into those muscles for replenishment. And that's the reason why we want that meal to be the highest, really, in carbohydrate of any of your other meals. We still want there to be protein. It should still have a little bit of fiber, ideally. It should still have a little bit of fat, but those should be more of the minority of that meal. How much carbohydrate, that is really going to depend on your individual needs, your insulin sensitivity. Do you have a history of insulin resistance, diabetes, prediabetes, these types of things? How much carbs can you tolerate? What does the rest of your day look like? So many factors. How much lean muscle mass do you have? But just start with the idea that that should be the greatest amount of carbohydrates that you are eating. Protein, again, like I said, we want to try to hit that leucine threshold, which is about 30 grams of protein. So I would recommend that that meal has about 30 grams of protein. Ideally, it's a complete protein source. And so you might have seen before that if you're consuming things like plant protein powders, then most of them are not complete protein sources unless they are formulated to have the right blend of different types of proteins. So if you're just doing like hemp protein or you're just doing brown rice protein, those are never going to be complete proteins because all plants are lacking in one or multiple amino acids. So it needs to have multiple plants that are put together. If you are not plant-based, then I really don't recommend doing a plant-based protein powder because not only do you not get as good of an amino acid ratio, but they also are higher in heavy metals. And so you're going to have to pay more money to get one that is heavy metal tested. And you're just going to get more bang for your buck by doing something that is an animal protein, unless, like I said, you are plant-based and that's your only option out there. So we're looking for about 30 grams of protein, ideally at a complete amino acid protein source. And for those that are eating animal proteins, that does not include collagen. Collagen is not a complete amino acid source. It is lacking in a couple amino acids. So if you are a collagen consumer, consume your collagen pre-exercise. There's some added benefit there because when you have blood flow going to a specific area, that collagen is elevated in your bloodstream and it can actually help to be able to kind of localize that collagen for soft tissue rebuilding and strengthening in that particular area. So there is some benefit to collagen pre-exercise, but post-exercise, I would not do collagen. I would do something like either egg, bone broth protein, our protein powder, which is Functional Fuel Pro. I've specially formulated it to be really the best that I believe is on the market. And it is a beef bone broth protein. So it's a complete amino acid source, but it also has the collagen peptides in there and it's hydrolyzed, which means they use a cold extraction process. There's no hexane, which a lot of protein powders contain, which is a chemical solvent. There's no hexane. It's cold extracted so that you get the highest amount of protein bioavailability. So it literally, like, you get all the protein from it, absorbs almost instantly once you consume it. So that is really my favorite option that's out there, and the one that I use every single day and love. And then the fibers, the fats, those can be incorporated, that we're not exercising after you get done with exercise. So you can definitely incorporate carbohydrate, or you can definitely incorporate fibers and fats. You don't want a lot because they will slow down how quickly those carbs and protein get to your muscles. But having them there is helpful because it does help stabilize blood sugar response, keep you satiated a little bit longer. And that way you can then wait, 4 hours or so until your next meal, whenever that might be. Electrolytes after your workout, you could definitely and should do a bit of a higher sodium source here. Sodium and carbohydrates work together to actually help blunt the cortisol response after exercise. And one of the things that we want to be really mindful of for women that have any endocrine conditions is that generally there is cortisol dysregulation that's at play, whether it's a thyroid disorder, it's PCOS, it's hypothalamic amenorrhea. All of those conditions are a high cortisol dysregulated state, even things like perimenopause and menopause, which aren't hormone conditions, but they're hormonal environmental shifts. So we want to make sure that you have a pretty decent load of sodium after the workout. That's where I would do something like the Element or the Redmond's, or you can just make your own and just add in unrefined salt like Celtic salt or Redmond's sea salt. So that's totally up to you, but the carbs and sodium do work together to be able to blunt that cortisol response. We don't want a ton of potassium there. Potassium does the opposite from an adrenal perspective. So I would not go too crazy with potassium. You're always going to want a little bit of potassium with your sodium, but like something like Element packets are great because they're 1,000 milligrams of sodium, but only 200 milligrams of potassium. So there's an even lower ratio than that 3-to-1 that I mentioned earlier, which is the ideal that we would be looking for prior to exercise. A little bit of magnesium can be really helpful, especially if you're someone that is prone to muscle cramping after exercise, or if you are exercising in really hot temperatures, or you are going to be exercising again later in the day. Then having some magnesium will help to prevent the muscle fatigue and muscle cramping that could happen. Whenever your muscles are fatigued, they're going to be more prone to cramping. So if you are working out and then you have to work out a few hours later, having some magnesium in between there can be really helpful to just kind of help that muscle regeneration so that you don't end up in that muscle fatigue type situation. This is also a really great time to use something like creatine. Creatine is naturally occurring in animal proteins. And so people that follow a vegetarian diet tend to be low in creatine stores. Creatine is the primary energy source that is used during the highest intensity exercise. So it is used during sprinting or something like Olympic lifting, where it is maximal effort for 1 or 2 repetitions. So the more that you do those types of workouts, the more you are going to deplete your creatine stores because your body's using it more readily. But creatine has tons of research. It's one of the most research-backed supplements that is out there. And there's tons of benefits even outside of physical exercise. So although as it relates to exercise, it can help with the recovery process. It can help your muscles recover and help to be able to actually get the carbs and protein into your muscles faster. It also has a ton of benefit to the brain, and there's a lot of research on its role in elderly populations and cognitive decline, different types of kind of cognitive impairment situations. And so it's really great for the brain. It also can help with liver detoxification too. So you get added benefit there. You do want to make sure that if you do consume creatine, that it's creatine monohydrate, not creatine crealkaline or any of those other fancy forms. A lot of them aren't as common anymore. I feel like they had their surge about 10 years ago, but they kind of claimed that they wouldn't bulk you or make you have as much water retention as creatine monohydrate, but that's actually totally false. Creatine monohydrate doesn't cause that. It does help to be able to hydrate your muscles. And so some people notice that like the weight on the scale might move up by a pound or so, but it's nothing noticeable to the naked eye. I've never seen more than a pound increase with creatine, and I've never noticed it in the way that my clothes fit or anything of that sort. So it's definitely not something that I would worry about if you are not trying to see big shifts happen in your body composition, that it's not going to make any of those detriments. If anything, it's only going to help during exercise, especially if you are engaging in more strenuous exercise, because if your muscles are more well hydrated, then you are less prone to dehydration. You can also do it pre-workout. The difference is that pre-workout, if you're doing any of those like high intensity sprinting or Olympic lifting type movements, it's going to help provide like a fuel source. So it's just like, okay, during exercise, your muscles are using carbohydrate. Well, if you add creatine to that and your muscles are going to be using creatine, then you're just giving it that fuel source it's utilizing. But most people don't do those types of exercises unless you are someone that is like an Olympic weightlifter and CrossFit, things of that sort. So if you are, then you can do it beforehand. If you're not doing those types of movements and you're just looking at the creatine for the recovery and some of the cognitive benefits, then I would do it after exercise, which is what I typically recommend doing. We also want to be mindful of not consuming a large portion of antioxidants during this time period. One of the things that happens during exercise is there is a lot of free radical formation, and there is a natural amount of oxidative stress that occurs. Oxidative stress is a normal part of really like the fuel burning process of our body turning the food that we eat into energy. But if it goes uncontrolled, then it leads to inflammation. And we know that oxidative stress is a big player in hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, for example, as well as PCOS. So we want this oxidative stress to be under control. However, we want a little bit of that oxidative stress to happen during exercise. I know that sounds crazy, but that's actually how we get the adaptation from exercise. And we don't want to blunt that. So it's the same thing as if you are if you have heard of any of these things before, is like you don't want to take an ice bath right after you work out because you can blunt the muscle adaptation. You may not want to take like ibuprofen immediately after an injury because it's going to blunt that inflammatory response that happens that allows your body to recover. So we want that acute inflammation to occur because that's how our body adapts and it learns to overcome and to build stronger muscles, to build a bigger and stronger cardiovascular system. But eventually we want to stop that process from happening. So I don't recommend doing a high dose of antioxidants in the immediate post-workout time period. However, outside of that time period, you should be flooding your body with antioxidants. So that's really where the difference comes in here. And antioxidants are going to be, they're a class. So there's a lot of things within that. You have like your polyphenols, which are things like berries, like blackberries and blueberries and cranberries and pomegranate. You have your green tea, you have cacao, you have vitamin C rich antioxidants like camu powder and lemons and oranges. All of those are your antioxidant family. So we want a ton of those in our diet. We just don't want a concentrated serving of it post-workout. I also would refrain from doing any potent anti-inflammatory supplements during this time period. So that would include things like curcuminoids, or what is the active compound in turmeric. It would also include things like omega-3s or fish oil, cod liver oil, any of those, boswellia, whatever it might be that you are using as an anti-inflammatory antioxidant supplement. Take those at the other point of the day. I like to wait at least 2 hours before consuming any of those potent sources. If you're having like some berries and leafy greens with your post-workout meal, I would not be worried about them. As long as you're having a normal portion size, a cup, a couple cups, you should not be running into this. It's really when we're using a concentrated serving, whether it's like a juice, a concentrate, a supplement, that we are going to be in a situation where it's going to be a really potent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant source. Now, the caveat to that is if you are training for a marathon or you are an athlete that is in competitive sport, then when you are in the final stages of like competition season, you have your marathon tomorrow, I would consume the antioxidants, anti-inflammatories right after exercise. Okay. That's the caveat, because I'm not worried at that point about the adaptation from the last year that you were practicing and training for what you're about to compete for. I am most worried about your recovery, about your body recovering as quickly as possible. So if you're like a week out, you feel like your base has already been built and now it's just about repetition of like keeping your muscles loose, getting the mileage in, getting your feet on the ground, all of those types of things, then that's okay for us to consume the antioxidants and anti-inflammatories afterwards. However, for the majority of people that aren't training, aren't competing in something, that are just training for life every single day, I would wait to consume those antioxidants and anti-inflammatories to another point in the day. Another one that's often put into this category too are nitrates, like beets. And nitrates are excellent around exercise. One of the reasons why is because they create something called vasodilation, which essentially means our blood vessels dilating and opening. And when our blood vessels dilate and open, blood can flow more easily. We can get oxygen to our working muscles faster. And there's quite a bit of research on the benefits of things like nitrates for endurance exercise, but also even for like weightlifting. I think that one of the research articles is on like 3-rep max bench press and things. So they can be really beneficial. You don't though want to have them after exercise because they are really high in antioxidants and you do need quite a bit to get this vasodilation effect. And why would you want to vasodilate after exercise? We want to vasodilate before exercise, before we want that oxygen. So do them in your pre-workout. Just make sure you have them at least 60 to 90 minutes before exercise, because that's how long it's going to take for it to get elevated in your bloodstream enough for these vasodilation effects to happen. You're going to need a very concentrated source. Just eating like a couple of beets and some leafy greens is probably not going to do it. You're going to need something like a beetroot shot. And there's a couple of brands that have this. Beat It as one. There's also Human, I know, makes one as well. So there's a couple of brands that you can look at that make a concentrated option where it's like 40 beets bottled into a little shot. that's probably the best way to go. And that's what I would recommend. And that's what I've done when I was working with athletes. So those would be your best options. Just make sure it's 60 to 90 minutes before. And then also make sure that if you are wanting to get the benefits from this, that you do it for consistently 8 days before you want that. So say again, you have like a big run or something coming up on Saturday, then you need to start this at least the Friday beforehand, because you need 8 days of continuous nitrate consumption for it to have an effect, for it to build up enough in the bloodstream. You also want to make sure that during that time period, you're not using any alcohol-based products in your oral microbiome. So no mouthwash or mouth rinse, because those kill the salivary enzymes, and the nitrates are actually absorbed and activated in our saliva. So if you're using the mouthwashes and things, you're actually destroying the ability for those nitrates to get absorbed and have that vasodilating effect. So those are just some little like tricks of the trade, little tips that I can offer you. I would say the other one that's probably not as popular anymore, but I think had some time, was watermelon juice. There's a company that's kind of what they specialize, is just watermelon juice. And that's because it contains L-citrulline, and L-citrulline has been shown to be helpful for recovery. I don't think the research is quite strong enough on the watermelon juice being quite potent enough, but don't think it hurts to do it. I mean, just keep in mind that watermelon juice is going to be pretty high in sugar and fructose. So if you were to do it, you would do it after exercise. I would probably just take the L-citrulline myself rather than go that route. And I just don't think that it's quite powerful enough to warrant that. But sometimes people are looking for all the options that they can do in these categories. And so I just want to bring that one up because that is one that sometimes people ask about. Now, I just want to wrap up by just giving you a little bit of like a physiology lesson behind why all this matters, or how this all works during exercise. I know that sometimes this can be boring, so that's why I wanted to do it at the end, so that you could get all of the meat of the conversation before we got into this. But there is something that is called oxidation. I mentioned it earlier, and oxidation really is the burning of substrates. And we have two main macronutrients that are energy macronutrients: carbohydrates and fat. We obviously have a third macronutrient, protein. During exercise, we burn primarily carbohydrates, a little bit of fat, and very little protein. And so that's where carbohydrates and fat really are the sole energy source. The intensity of exercise dictates how much carbohydrates or fat is utilized for the working muscles. And there is never only one that's utilized. There's always a little bit of both, but there is what we call a crossover effect, or a crossover point that happens. And this crossover point happens at about 50% of your VO2 max, which is like your maximum intensity of exercise. And once that crossover effect happens, your body then begins burning a substantially larger amount of carbohydrate, until when you get to 100% VO2 max, you burn almost no fat. And if you want to really nerd out about this, you can get a VO2 max test done. I have done one myself. It was very painful, but it's really cool because you do get a report that shows you, it's done on a treadmill generally, or a bike. And mine was on a treadmill. And you'll see that at each minute, how much of these substrates are coming from carbs versus fat. And then when that crossover effect happens for you, and then with that information, you can determine, okay, based off of where I am and where I should be, is my body not burning one of these substrates efficiently enough? And if it's not, then we can actually shift what you're eating around exercise even further to maximize your body's ability to burn what we want to burn during exercise. So at about 0 to 50% of intensity, you're burning about 30% of fat and very minimal amount of carbohydrate. So you kind of start off at very low intensity, burning about 60%. It drops down to about 30% once you get to about 50% of fat. Carbohydrate, you start off by burning about like 10% of carbohydrate. And then once you get over to that crossover point, you're now burning about 40% or so. And then once that crossover happens at about 50%, then you start burning almost 70% to 100% carbohydrate, and you're down to 20% to 0% of fat. So that's why during zone 2, which is one of the forms of exercise we have in our strength and hormones workouts, we really make sure and we preach that they need to be done in the right heart rate zone. Because if they're done in the right heart rate zone, you should be burning primarily fat and very little carbohydrate. And it's when that crossover happens to where you start burning primarily carbohydrate that there becomes more of a cortisol response that occurs, and that exercise becomes much more intense for the body. And we want to make sure that we are really intentional about what is the zone that we are exercising in, because that's what the way we're going to get the adaptation that we desire. Now, you can try to calculate, get kind of a rough average of your VO2 max. If you want to take a look at this yourself, there is a calculation. You just take your resting heart rate. So you could take your resting heart rate right now. You can look at what it is on like your Apple Watch or Oura Ring. And you'll calculate that, or you could do it by measuring your pulse for about 20 seconds if you don't have any of those options. And you'll multiply that number by 3. So say your resting heart rate is 50. That's a pretty low resting heart rate, but say it's 50, you'll multiply that by 3, and that gives you 150. And then you're going to divide that number by your resting heart rate. So you're going to take your maximum heart rate and you're going to divide your maximum heart rate by your resting heart rate. So 150 divided by 5, and then multiply that number by 15.3. And that'll give you what your rough VO2 max is. So that's a way to get around doing a VO2 max test, but it obviously doesn't tell you all of the things that are happening during exercise, essentially when that crossover is happening and how much of those substrates you're burning per hour. But that is why the importance of carbohydrate during those moderate to higher intensity exercise is so critical. And that's why we primarily focus on carbohydrates as your primary fuel source before exercise, because that's primarily what is burned. Fats are not burned, especially once you get into more of the moderate intensity type exercise. They also are very difficult for your body to use as a substrate. They slowly digest. They just don't provide as quick of an energy source. And so you can consume them prior, but you're generally going to notice the performance declines, that you have digestive discomfort, and you're not going to be really maximizing what your body's potential is during that workout. So that is the reason for the carbohydrates. If you don't eat prior to exercise, then your body is going to typically burn more fat. However, just because you're burning more fat doesn't mean that you are burning more, that you're actually creating a fat loss effect from happening. So that's important to notice, to realize, because most of that fat burning comes from your muscle during exercise. And if you're trying to lose body fat, you don't want the fat coming primarily from muscle. You want the body fat coming primarily from your visceral fat. And in order for you to burn visceral fat, you can't do it around exercise. You need it to be in a caloric deficit and through the overall makeup of what your diet and exercise looks like. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Now we have a lot more resources on this, and I have a course that I created called Eat for Strength. So I'm going to link to it below if you want to dive deeper into any of these topics. I provide you with all the specifics in terms of like portions and amounts and things, as well as we go into some further supplement guidelines. And there is also recipes incorporated in there as well for both pre and post workout. So that's a really great all-in-one resource for this. But I hope that this episode was helpful. Share it with a friend, give us a 5-star rating in your podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another guest interview.